Session. Our first presenter this afternoon is Elise Melanson. She's going to be presenting on, I love when I can lift more than a dude, women's experience of gender expectations in mixed gender ideas. Elise is an honors student, so this is the end card of her honors work, and she's under my supervision, so I'm going to turn it over to Elise.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Okay. My name is Elise, and I am a kinesiology undergraduate student in my final semester. I'm really excited to share a bit about my project on just women's experiences of gender in gyms. So first I want to talk about the potential significance of exploring gender in gyms. And I want to begin with talking about hegemonic masculinity. So the definition of this is the maintenance of domination not by the sheer exercise of force, but primarily through consensual social practices, social forms, and social structures produced in specific sites. And a gym is one of these specific sites. So shown through ethnographic research that gyms have their own unique culture and social practices, and because they were created by and for men, historically these social practices have been made in a way that disproportionately limits the experience of women in the space. So if we look to explore and understand this power imbalance a little bit better, it can maybe increase women's quality of experience in the space, but also how many women enter the space, and then in turn make changes in greater society. So there's not a ton of literature on this topic, but what there is can be categorized into the history of gender in gyms, perceptions as a result of the history, and then how things have kind of changed currently. So historically, the pioneers of strength-based exercise were men, and as a result, all of the ideas and findings in the beginning were geared towards men. So when gyms gained popularity in the 1970s, as a result of the bodybuilding trend, it was mostly men in the space. And women didn't enter the space until the 1980s, and that was primarily as a result of the Jane Fonda aerobic trend, which, as a result, the activities became very gendered because there was a gendered introduction to the space. So these gendered introductions, like I said, fueled the gender ideals. And so research shows that both men and women perceive strength-based activities as male and masculine, and aerobic activities as female or feminine. The goals are also gendered, with perceived ideals of women decreasing size in both muscle mass and fat mass, and then men increasing size in muscle mass. And so further, because actual physical spaces of gyms are usually categorized as aerobic and strength training, these spaces have become gendered as well. Most women and men perceive the aerobic section as like a more female area, and then the strength-based section as a more male area. So this is starting to shift a little bit as a result of feminist movements, and also a shift in the feminine body ideal. But previous research is showing that although women are entering the space more, they still are very cognizant of gender ideals, but they do so in a way that kind of limits them in the sense that they're very conscious of what the working calls the glass ceiling on women's strength, which is essentially how strong a woman can be or how much muscle mass she can have while still being considered feminine. So now to talk about my project. It's a qualitative case study focused on one mixed gender gym here in Regina. I'm exploring two research questions. The first is what effect, if any, does the prevalence of men in strength-based areas of the gym have on women's experiences in the space? And then what effect, if any, does the gendering of gyms and gender expectations have on women's experiences in strength-based areas of the gym? So I spoke to 17 women ranging from ages early 20s to mid 60s, And there was a good variety of experience. So there was some women that it was their first year entering the space, and then other women that had been in there for 20 plus years. I did this data collection through 2 methods. The first was 3 focus groups with 3 to 4 participants, and then 7 one-on-one interviews. The data analysis was done through emergent coding methods that just looked at recurring concepts or ideas throughout the data. So for this presentation, I'm going to talk about my preliminary findings for the second research question, which focuses on the gendering of gyms and gender expectations. So this can be categorized as how women are seeing gender in gym and then how they are responding to this perception. So the women that I spoke to, their experiences could be categorized into exercises, behaviors, and level of consciousness. So when it comes to exercises, many women spoke on upper body exercises or compound lifts such as bench press, deadlift, and squat as seen as male or masculine, and then lower body, specifically glutes, being seen as female or feminine. When looking at behaviors, overwhelmingly, the women reported that they only really witnessed men taking part in aggressive behaviors such as grunting or dropping weights. And then further, a lot of the women went as far as to say they have never felt a desire to do either of those behaviors. And additionally, it was noted by a few women that they felt that they were more likely to prioritize their form over the amount of weight they lifted in comparison to the men around them. So when looking at levels of consciousness, many of the women felt they were more conscious of their appearance and behavior as a result of their gender than the men around. And in regards to appearance, many spoke about how they felt they were sexualized as a result of their clothing choices and their gender and the way that exercise looks if they were like sexually suggestive. Others commented on how men had less to consider in regards to their gym clothing, and the women also appear to be more conscious of certain behaviors relating to their performance, so they would have to be conscious of where men were located in reference to them, and what they could do to decrease the likelihood of them staring or approaching them. So now talk about their response to these perceptions. So the first one I'm going to look at here is the fear of under-adhering to the gender expectations. And this wasn't super common, but it did come up a few times. A few women reported grappling between their upper body mass or overall strength in relation to their femininity. But it didn't come up as much as these next two here. So the next is a fear of over-adhering. So this was much more common. Several women talked about how they were either self-conscious of or altered their practices in order to not be seen as too feminine. This involved being hesitant to train glutes too often or only doing cardio and not doing any strength training. For a few women, this seemed to be fueled by men teasing them for training glutes too often, and other women were conscious of potentially being seen as weak because of their gender, and as a result, they would actually sacrifice performance in some situations so that they didn't have to go put away their weight and look like they were weak in front of men. So this kind of ties into the next year, which is actively breaking gender expectations. So by far, this was the most common response to gender expectations in gyms, and many women reported being hesitant to do so when they first began entering the gym space, but as they got more confident, this became more common for them to do. And so they began breaking gender expectations and enjoying it as their confidence increased in the space. So this was sometimes done unintentionally and was only noticed when others responded to it, when someone would say something to them about them breaking gender expectations. But more commonly, it was actually done through conscious efforts, and this involved taking part in more compound movements like bench press, deadlifts, and squats, or completing upper body exercises regularly and trying to perform better than men, both in strength and in mobility. And all of the women that spoke about this referred to it as being rewarding or improving their confidence. So to conclude, I'd like to touch on my findings in comparison to previous literature and then the significance of my findings. Previous literature emphasized that gym activities were categorized as cardio being feminine and strength training being masculine. Although this idea was present, it was not as popular as the idea of categorizing upper body and compound lifts as masculine and lower body and glutes as feminine. And previous literature also categorized goals by gender, with women wanting to decrease body size while men wanting to increase muscle mass. my study found that although a lot of women entered the space with those goals correlating with the gender expectations, it actually shifted as they got more comfortable, and all of their goals centered around health or strength. Previous literature also spoke on the physical space being gendered. This did not come up in my data at all. So when talking about the significance of my findings, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, while talking about gyms as a catalyst for social change, I mentioned that the purpose of this study is to give insight into these social practices in the specific site of gyms and how they affect the subordinate group being women. And my findings suggest that although women do still experience gender expectations, in gyms, the expectations may be shifting and the extent of their limiting effects may be decreasing. Further, women's positive relationships to breaking gender expectations set upon them could portray a trend in practices that work to dismantle the presence of hegemonic masculinity in mixed gender fitness spaces by shifting social practices and fighting binary gender categorization. Ultimately, further research exploring the gender experience of gyms must be done from the perceptions of all individuals that are in the space, because I only spoke to women. But I'm excited to explore that more in my graduate studies.
Thanks, Elise. Questions for Elise?
Elise, that was a really great presentation. Just really, really well put together. So thank you. I just had a question about the participants in your study. Did any of them tend to work out in like partners or groups? When I think of guys like grunting and working out together, I'm always thinking one guy's squatting, the other guy's pushing the weights, and they're kind of showing off to each other.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, the women. There was really interesting inter-female relationships. Like a lot of women were more hesitant to approach other women, so there was a lot of barriers to like maybe getting in a situation where you were working out in a group. But something else that did come up is that the women that worked out with other men, like their boyfriends or their friends, if they were working out in a group that had other men, they were stared at and approached by the other men significantly less, even when the men that they usually come with didn't come with them. So that kind of increased their comfort level a little bit, but that's all I have on like groups working out.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yep, Scotty?
I just had a question, I guess, on the research on the data collection side of things. Did you find any significant difference between sort of topics that came up in the focus groups versus one-on-one, or did you look at those in isolation at all?
Yeah, I looked at that a little bit, and the biggest difference was I felt that in the interviews with that were one-on-one, the women were a lot more, how should I say it, critical of other women, which makes sense, obviously. And then also some things that came up about the demographic of men that made them uncomfortable came up that they didn't talk about in the focus group. I think fear of looking like they were discriminating against certain groups.
Any other questions for Elise? I have a question for you.
Okay.
So, and I know that you talked about this and about we have to expand on this. Do you have a sense, because you do work out in gyms, can gyms also be a place to shift gender stereotypes for men?
I think there definitely is room for that. That isn't something I've thought about a lot because I've been working so much on the avenue of women's perceptions. I definitely think so. I think gyms have a way because they're so, what would be the word? Like animalistic in a sense. Like people feel comfortable acting a certain way in gyms that they don't normally feel. So it kind of can be like a breeding ground for some toxic masculinity. So I think there could be shifts. I have no idea what that would look like, but I think there's definitely room for it.
Any other questions for Elise? Thank you, Elise, for your presentation. NHL players. I'll turn it over to you, Alex.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Lorena. So as Lorena said, my name is Alex Watson, and my study is NHL draft gambling, use of the impact score to find successful NHL players. So just to give a quick update on my study is still a master's project that is still in progress. I'm just over the midway point of collecting my data, but I'll be presenting on my preliminary finding and giving my interpretation and analysis of why I'm finding what I'm finding. So just a quick overview of the draft before we begin. The draft is an annual event that takes place each year where each NHL team has the opportunity to select players that may play for their team in the future. I say may because, as you'll see in a few slides, it's not very often that players get to play in the NHL even if they are drafted. So the draft is 7 rounds long, consisting of 30 picks in each round. For this study, it's now 32 because of the expansion teams, but the time frame this study took place is 30 picks. My main motivation for doing a study on the draft is that the draft is something I've always been interested in. My interest has really peaked in the later rounds of the draft recently because teams who've won the Stanley Cup recently have used those late round picks to their advantage. We've just seen Tampa Bay win back-to-back Stanley Cups, led by Niki Afseth and Gregory P, 2 players they found after the first round of the draft. So to help find these players, I've developed a metric I call the impact score. So the impact score is a percentage-based metric that takes into account the player's points per game divided by team goals per game. So it measures the player's point contribution relative to their teammates. The reason I do this is to try to find players who may have played on low-scoring teams, but were much better than their teammates. It was originally designed based off of graded points who, during the year, played for the Moose Jaw Warriors, who were not a good team. Point accumulated 91 points, which is the total between goals and assists, and the closest person to him on that roster was somebody with 55, which was a massive difference. And that should scream that this guy's going to be a stud right there and then. So the thing to keep in mind about the impact score, as you'll see later on, it's important to keep in mind what I originally designed it for. I originally designed it for first-year major junior forwards who should have been drafted in the first round. So what the last phrase means what I mean by the last phrase of should have been drafted in the first round is that they had similar scores to those selected in the first round. If we go back to the graded point example, points impact score was only rivaled by Sam Reinhart and Leon Draisaitl in that draft, the second and third overall picks in the draft. So that's right there should have suggested that point should have been a top 5 player. So prior research on draft has found that less than half of draftees even play in a single game, and the odds get worse and worse as each round progresses, until round 5 where the odds are pretty much the same. I know for this study I looked at the frequencies and it's approximately 42% chance of playing a game after round 1 and only 22% chance of playing at least 100 games after round 1. So not great odds of even playing one game and even worse odds of having a long-lasting career. So this right here kind of serves as an introduction to the purpose of this study. The purpose is to see if the impact score can offer some predictability of rounds 2-7 and help improve those low odds. So to do this, I've designed 3 success measures at the NHL level that my research questions are formulated around. So the first success measure is career games played. So career games played is just the total number of games each player played during their NHL career. Time on ice per game refers to the average amount of ice time a player played on any given night. And points per minute played is simply the NHL player's total career points divided by the total minutes that they played. So my research questions for this are all related to whether forwards and defensemen with higher impact scores achieve more success in these measures than forwards and defensemen with lower impact scores. Going into my study, my original hypothesis was that forwards with higher impact scores would achieve more success in these measures than forwards with lower impact scores. However, I expected the results for defensemen to be more of a mixed bag, simply because the role of defensemen is to defend. Therefore, using an offensive-based metric to predict their performance probably isn't going to lead to the most consistent results. So my study is a secondary data analysis with all my data being collected from hockey statistic websites such as HockeyDB, Elite Prospects, and Hockey Reference, being cross-referenced with each respective website for each league. So during my study, I did come across some missing data for high school teams. For some reason, the high school stats weren't there for the teams, but they were there for the players. So to counter this, I used the meetings for the high school teams that I did collect to fill those empty voids. My sample is focused on the 2005-2015 draft. The results you're seeing today are only up to 2010. I started at 2005 because that was the first draft of 7 rounds. And I ended at 2015 just because players drafted after that may have not been given the opportunity to fully establish themselves. So for this, I'm only looking at forwards and defensemen. Goaltenders are excluded. Unfortunately, there's no way to measure their performance using the impact score. I have a theory on them, but I couldn't fit it into this study. And kids who passed away before their career began. So there's only 1 or 2 that this happened to. And the reason I chose to exclude them is because I knew the New York Rangers had a prospect that passed away, and they received a compensation draft pick for him. So I'm just going to use the player they selected with that pick instead, just because we don't know what that player would become. The table you see below is what my sample looks like. You can see that there's an even percentage of forwards and defensemen selected in round 1 and rounds 2 to 7, which was quite interesting to see. Going into my study, there were some variables that I needed to control for. I'll explain why they're important and how I control for them. The first variable being age. Age was an important variable for this because players who are typically older will usually have a higher impact score than younger players. While this isn't always the case, it was still something that we needed to control for, especially when a player had an extra year of development. Place of origin is the next variable that I controlled for, and I've done this using 2 different components, country of birth and country of development. Country of birth refers to where the player was born, and country of development refers to where the player played the junior hockey. A lot of times, these end up being the same country, but there are some instances where they're different. The specific situation where this occurs frequently is where players play in a European country with a small hockey program. They usually go over to like Sweden and participate in their larger hockey program there. And the third variable, and the variable that I thought was going to be the most important, was league quality. These players are coming from a variety of leagues with many different skill levels, so it was important to control for this. A player playing in a top professional league, such as Russia's top hockey league, the KHL, is going to have a lower impact score than somebody playing in a lower skill league, like high school league. So to control for this, I had to rank the leagues into 9 distinct league groups. Unfortunately, there is no definitive ranking of all the leagues, so I had to use my own personal knowledge and expertise to rank them. While collecting my data, I did have to add a 10th league group, type 11, as there were about 8 or 9 players that were drafted from leagues that I had never heard of before, and they didn't fit into any of these categories. Before I get into what I see for my results, I'll talk about my descriptives and frequencies regarding my population. The key takeaway from the descriptive table is that the success measures are much higher on average in round 1 than rounds 2 to 7, which is consistent with the prior research that has found low success odds in rounds 2 to 7. So for the league group frequencies, we can see that a large portion of our draftees come from the major junior and United States Hockey League group. The only thing that I expect to change in the league group frequency is a higher percentage of the USDP, the United States Development Program, to rise in round 1, just because I know that the 2010s were sort of the rise of that program. Continuing on with the frequencies, just like major junior, we see that Canada and USA dominate the country of birth and country development. The only thing I expect to change here is a higher percentage for Finland when it comes to country birth for round 1. I know that a lot of Finns started getting drafted in the first round in the coming years, so I expect that percentage to slightly increase. Moving on to my results, we'll start with the first measure of career games played. For round 1, we see a significant R-squared change of 0.136, and for rounds 2 to 7, we see a significant R-squared change of 0.004. While both are significant, the change in R-squared for round 1 was much larger than the change in R-squared for rounds 2 to 7. And this is a consistent theme that we'll see across all the different success measures. And I'll offer my rationale and analysis on why I think this is the case. So significant variables in these models were impact in league group, with impact being the most important variable in the round 1 model, and league group being the most important variable in the rounds 2 to 7 model. For time on ice per games played, we can see that we have a significant R-squared change again of 0.120 for round 1, and a significant R-squared change of 0.017 for rounds 2 to 7. So this time we have 2 additional significant variables added in round 1, birth country and position. And just position for rounds 2 to 7 added. The reason why position became an important variable for this is because defensemen will typically play more minutes than forwards on any given night. My best guess to why birth country became a more important variable in this model was based on prior research that suggested North American players will typically play more minutes than their European counterparts despite similar skill levels. For points per minute, we do see that, again, we have a significant R-squared change of 0.117 when adding the impact score for round 1, and just a significant R-squared change of 0.017 for rounds 2 to 7. Again, we see similar significant variables in position, group, and impact for both round 1 and rounds 2 to 7, with impact being the most important variable in round 1 and league group being the most important variable in rounds 2 to 7. So this really led me to question my results. Why was there such a larger change in R-squared in round 1, but hardly anything in rounds 2 to 7? And we can see that impact was the most important variable in round 1, so why would it be the most important variable in rounds 2 to 7? So I developed 2 ideas on why this possibly could be. The first idea was that rounds 2 to 7 contain a lot of players that have 0 for all the success measures, as they never played an NHL game. So that makes it difficult to distinguish which one's better. The second rationale I have for this was, if I go back to my roots of my metric, I originally designed my metric for first-year major junior forwards who should have been drafted in the first round. And finding the players that should have been drafted in the first round is quite rare for the draft, as most of them players drafted after round 1 shouldn't have been drafted in round 1. So I decided to look at my descriptives and frequencies to see if it was originally measuring what I designed it to do. So in the years that I looked at the draft, we found 14 first-year major junior forwards over 35%, a percentage or impact score that you typically see in the first round. 12 of these 14 forwards played at least one game, which was a much higher percentage than the 42% established earlier for the after round 1. However, only 6 of them played at least 100 games. This number was a little lower than I expected, and I expect that one to rise as the years continue on because I know there's a few good players that get selected in the upcoming drafts. I decided to do the same thing with defensemen and looked at defensemen who had an impact score over 20%. Again, something you typically see in the first round of the draft. Here we had 20 first-year major junior D-men, and 14 of those 20 played in at least one NHL game. However, only 6 played at least 100 games. So what I took away from this was maybe the impact score does have some value if used on the correct population, and maybe only up to a certain point. I know I looked at the descriptives and frequencies for 30% and over 15%, but it just didn't have the same predictability as the first round scores. So that's what my takeaway from this is that the impact score might have some value, but only when you're looking for those specific players that should be selected in round 1. Once you pass that barrier, it's tough to distinguish between a 30% and a 25%. With that, we'll conclude my study.
Questions for Alex?
Thanks, Alex. Very interesting. Have you tried to include in your model anything related to injury?
No, I have not. I know that that's a factor, but it's just an unknown factor. It's part of like the unknown of development. Like this is just based in theory. There's no guarantee that a player would be the same player they are if they're selected by a different team, because the circumstances just change. Like maybe they get hit in the game that they would have never played if they were drafted by a different team, which led to injury. There's always that unknown factor with the draft.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? I have a question for you, Alex. If you're talking to a scout based on your initial findings here, what would you tell a scout?
I would suggest to the scout to keep an eye on those players, especially the ones that should have been drafted in the first round. I mean, we've seen a high percentage of them have at least played one NHL game, so that means the team at some point at least valued them as an NHL quality prospect. But you always got to use the eye test along with analytics. I know there's many in the analytic community that will disagree with me, but the numbers are just one aspect of it. You got to use that eye test. You got to judge their character. There's so many different variables that go into making a successful player, and I think that's why there's some that in here that don't achieve success at the NHL level. It's just those other variables that are hard to measure.
Other questions? All right. Thank you, Alex, for your presentation. He's a master's student with Dr. Karen Campbell, and he's going to be talking to you today about contrast training, effect on strength and sprint time. Turn it over to you, Thomas.
Before I quickly get started, I just want to make sure mic is working for hearing. Okay. Hi, again, my name is Bresciani. I'm a master's of science student here, working under Dr. Campbell, and we're going to look on the effect on strength. Contrast training on strength and sprint time. Quick overview, French contrast training method. This is where I got my idea from. That's where you work from the highest force production exercise. You select multiple exercises through the force velocity curve, finishing your workout set with the highest velocity exercise, with little to no rest in between exercise selection. The thing I have with this is it requires a lot of setup or multiple setups, a lot of space used. And then with French contrast training, it shows an increase in any type of power output, such as triple jump, broad jump, vertical jump, or counter movement jumps. The significance of our research that I'd like to look at is the evaluating the extremes of contrast training. So looking at the highest power output exercise, and then immediately going into the highest velocity exercise, and kind of skipping that middle ground to reduce total volume while getting positive physiological changes and reducing the amount of exercises needed for this training method. The study the effect of contrast training on a 10-meter sprint time. Studies have shown that 10-meter sprint time is kind of the forefront of athlete development and excellence in their sport on any ground-based sport. And then the ability to program at the extremes of the force velocity curve, so at the extremes of both ends. The purpose of the study is to see if a reduction in exercise selection or working from the high force production or high velocity exercise can have the same effect or greater effect as the French contrast style of training or just contrast style of training, and to help increase the efficiency and power training exercise program cycle. In my experience, I completed this style of training as a football athlete at the university level, and I found a lot of success with this, and so did my athletes beside me. But what I find now in the strength and conditioning field is that it does take up a lot of space, and if you have a large group or a small gym, it becomes very challenging to program. So methodology I'd like to use is a high-performance male and female athletes between the ages of 18 and 30. So realistically looking at either professional or collegiate athletes working on force and power development. As an example, we have a control group where it would be equal in male and female subjects who would follow a basic strength training program, and then the contrast training group working through that extreme contrast training, again, equal male and female subjects, for a 8-week training cycle with testing of a 10-meter sprint time and a 1 rep max back squat as our parameters. Any questions?
Thank you, Thomas. Questions for Thomas? I'm so impressed that you guys are getting this done in like 3 minutes.
Thanks, Thomas. Quite interesting. Why did you choose a 10-meter sprint time?
There's a couple studies done specifically on the NFL Combine that was really the only test at the Combine that had any significance of success in the NFL. Specifically to receivers and running backs, that's the one that it correlated to the most. But if you look at any sport specifically, a lot of times their acceleration is within 10 meters. Anything after that is very minimal before they have to change direction or change their body in some form, aspect, or way.
And do you think there's some application of this to ice hockey as well?
Yes. I think just like the speed of the game, ice hockey, ring at, any type of those sports, I think that 10-meter sprint time is probably very valuable. And from what I found, hasn't really been looked into yet.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions for Thomas? Thomas, you talked about that this one requires a lot of space. How much space? Do you have a sense of what do you need?
The French contrast training, I mean, you can complete it in like a single rack. I'm looking more for like a team aspect, right? If we think of our high performance center here at the University of Regina, you bring in a team of even 10 or 12 athletes. It's very challenging to kind of coordinate your your gym space to allow them to go from a high force progression like a back squat into a counter movement jump into an assisted squat without taking up 2 or 3 or 4 racks for one exercise. So then when you're trying to do it in a team setting, it becomes a challenge. So then we end up compromising some of that work in order to complete it, which then reduces your results of that exercise or that exercise program.
I have a question here, just following up that the 10-meter sprint. Any thoughts or consideration to sport or activity that doesn't necessarily have those quicker, or smaller playing surface and quicker changes in direction, like a track and field? I think about Usain Bolt, who was a notoriously slow starter, but untouchable from about 35 to 100.
Yeah, I kind of, just based on the amount of team sports or sports that fit that parameters, I thought we would get a lot of information from using the 10-meter sprint. It would be interesting to increase it to even a 40-meter or a 100-meter sprint. I just think there's not a whole lot of research or evidence on that, the 10-meter side, and I think it would have a greater impact on the industry and the community.
And what about if that 100 meters was partway through that movement, so from 45 to 55 meters or something, any difference from kind of any perspective?
Yeah, I think that in that same study that I referred to about the NFL earlier, it did show that velocity in their 40-meter also had a great significance, actually in all positions, so not just receiver and DB. But the number wasn't significant. It was very close, but it wasn't significant in their success in the NFL. But that was kind of what led to that study, and then the finding was the 10-meter sprint time was supported.
Thanks, Thomas. Great presentation. My question is about like the training program design. My thoughts were, if you were to get one group to do just a strength-based program, and then a second group to do both strength-based exercise in combination with high-velocity power-type exercises, it would seem probably intuitive that you would see a decrease in power and speed in the group that is implementing those exercises. So my question is, in the group that is doing a strength-based program, would there be implementation of power or speed exercises, but just not in a format with the shorter rest? Would it just be included?
No, I think to have the greatest impact from the study, that it would be focused on power movements or power exercises for that basic strength training control group. It just wouldn't be put in the aspect of contrast training. I think even if we had a little more information on it, even doing the control group as a contrast training, and then the group that we're studying would be what I would call the extreme contrast training. So kind of looking at the extremes of both ends.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for your presentation. And he's going to be presenting on cardiovascular and sleep metrics in Parkinson's disease patients in an online exercise program, initial descriptive results of the pilot study. Let's turn it over to you, Joe.
Okay, again, my name is Joe, and we're looking at at cardiac and sleep parameters of Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's disease is becoming more prevalent in Canada. It's expected that within the next decade, at least 1% of all private households will have at least one person with Parkinson's disease. And this patient population tends to show a lot of sleep dysfunction relating to slow wave sleep and REM sleep as well. It's starting to show now that exercise can potentially help reduce some of these complications in sleep dysfunction. But what's not really known is how does this affect the cardiac cycle timing intervals. So from the research available, it looks like systolic function in Parkinson's disease is affected. Specifically, they look at myocardial deformations, so how hard the heart is squeezing, that the parameter that's shown to be altered. But again, there's really nothing to describe some of the finer details relating to the timing intervals in this patient population. So the purpose of this study, it's still ongoing, we're still recruiting patients, but the purpose of the study was to take a look at our cohort and try to characterize the cardiac cycle timing intervals. So we had Parkinson's disease patients come in, we got them to do a Montreal Cognitive Assessment Test. They had to score at least a 23 on this test. And if they scored a 23, then we gave them an actigraph, which is a little wristwatch that they wear. And they put this on an hour before they went to sleep and kept it on for an hour after they woke up. And this watch, it tells us information relating to their sleep efficiency. We also gave them a seismocardiogram or a cardiac sensor that they put on their sternum for 1 minute, once per day. And this device records the vibrations of the heart right at the sternum. And it allows us to map when the valves of the heart are opening and closing, so we can get a better idea of what their cardiac cycle timing intervals are like. So from our cohort, what we found was there's relative to the normal data in the literature, we have reduced isovolumic relaxation times. So that's how long the heart is relaxing when it's filling up with blood. And they also have reduced performance indices. And a large reason why the performance indices are reduced is because compared to the 280 to 290 millisecond systolic time that normal people have, the Parkinson's disease group tends to have a systolic time that's closer to 350 milliseconds. When we took our Parkinson's disease patients and split them up into exercisers and non-exercisers, our sample size was relatively small, so there was really no difference in between each group. And we found that the sleep efficiency in this cohort was pretty normal, between 75 to 85%. So these cardiac intervals appear as is, even with common and controlled sleep efficiency parameters. Thank you.
Any questions for Joe? Thanks, Patrick.
Joe, what was their HPI, their heart performance index?
It was 0.4. So usually in the healthy range, males are about 0.53, give or take about 0.05, and females are approximately 0.51. Above the age of 60, and these guys, they were closer to 0.36 to 0.4. Yeah.
And did it seem to make a difference based on any of the age? You know, age can have an effect on that, or did you even look at that?
We did, but everybody was quite a bit older than 60, or 60, right around that mark and above. Like if we
That's very young, remember?
Yeah. So if we take a look at the mean, it was about 64 plus or minus. I can't remember exactly. So
did you also look at any activity levels?
we did. So 6 people were exercising for at least 150 minutes per week. And the other 5 stated, so those were non-exercisers there, they stated that they weren't exercising. But generally speaking, we were pretty active, like they clean up around the house and do things like that. So that can also have a role, right, in maintaining cardiac function over time.
Thank you.
Just to follow up with what you just said, Joe, about the non-exercising group, you talked about that they were actually sort of active, maybe around the house. So what would be the ideal? What you would look for if you could recruit the ideal non-exercising group? What would that look like?
Well, I guess in this case, we asked people if they exercise for this time interval, and they stated no, right? So they fell within that category. more sedentary, the better for our purposes in this case. Yeah, so that's really what we look for is, people who are more sedentary than even just kind of cleaning around the house.
Any other questions for Joe? All right, thank you, Joe, for your presentation.
over here are the bacteria that are the most common, and the ones in these two boxes are the ones that comprise approximately 90% of all the bacteria in the gut. So, the gut bacteria play a really important role in human health and disease. And these ones here are some of the ones that have been shown by research to be associated with human good health. So, how exactly does the gut microbiota help us in our health? One of the primary ways is they help us harvest energy from our diet by fermenting oligosaccharides into short-chain fatty acids, or SCFAs. These SCFAs help us with our immunity by maintaining the intestinal epithelial barrier and by reducing inflammation. The gut bacteria are also really important for protein and lipid metabolism and synthesis of essential vitamins. So imbalances of these gut microbial communities can disrupt this normal functioning of the microbiome. It can lead to increased intestinal permeability, or as you may know it as a leaky gut, which is essentially when bacteria and toxins are able to cross over into the bloodstream, which increases inflammation and increases individuals' risk of metabolic and cardiovascular disease, as well as mental health issues. So these are just a few studies showing those same trends that I've mentioned. This one over here looked at obesity. They looked at lean and obese twins, and they found that the obese twins had much lower microbial diversity. This one looked at individuals with hypertension, and again, it's the same trend that individuals with hypertension have much lower microbial diversity than their healthy counterparts. I like this graph quite a bit because here they actually determine which bacterial genera are enriched in hypertensive individuals versus their healthy counterparts. All of these bacteria here in the hypertensive individuals are all actually opportunistic pathogens that would increase inflammation and cause infection, whereas these in the healthy controls are ones involved in SCFA production and would reduce inflammation. The gut microbiota also have an impact on mental health. As you can see this study, they looked at individuals who had major depressive disorder. You can see this really significant difference between the microbial diversity of people who had depression and those who didn't. So, in general, gut imbalances lead to increased inflammation and increased risk of diseases. So now you might be wondering what constitutes a microbial imbalance in your gut. So, microbial colonization of the gut actually begins right at birth, when you're born, from the bacteria that are in your mother. And this continues to grow and diversify until about 3 years of age. At this point, the microbiota begins to stabilize into an adult-type microbiome, which remains relatively stable throughout adulthood, accepting major diet changes or diseases. However, at this point, in older adults, the composition of the gut microbiota again begin to change, and the same two trends are noticed here as are noticed in the diseases that I mentioned on the previous slide, which are decreased diversity and increased inflammatory phenotype. However, research has shown that good diet, as well as exercise lifestyle, as well as good exercise, can actually improve species diversity in the gut. So this is basically what led me to my research question, which is to explore the relationship between the gut microbiota diversity and mental and physical health in a cohort of healthy older adults. Because we know that aging is related to gut dysbiosis and increased risk of diseases, but we also know that healthy lifestyle factors can attenuate some of these. So we want to know, in these healthy older adults, what trends can be noticed. So the first step of data collection was administering a lifestyle survey to participants on 5 Qualtrics, where we collected their demographic and medical history data. We also used standardized questionnaires to assess their stress, mental health, and sleep quality, also their physical activity levels, eating patterns and behaviors, and their trait mental and physical energy and fatigue levels. Once we determined participants' eligibility from their survey results, we invited them to the Camera Labs over here for an in-person visit to assess their cardiometabolic health. So cardiovascular health measurements, which was blood pressure. We had them seated in that couch right there, and we put this automated cuff on them on their left arm, and we took 5 measurements, and we left them in a dimly lit room. We wanted them as relaxed as possible, and we discarded the first 2 measurements in average class 3 to avoid white coat syndrome. After that, we had the participants lie down for about 10 minutes to be even more relaxed so that we could assess their pulse wave velocity. So pulse wave velocity is assessed by measuring the pulse at the carotid and at the femoral arteries. We measure the distance between them. And because of the time that it takes for the blood to travel from the carotid to the femoral arteries is the pulse transit time. So we can use that distance over that time to calculate central pulse wave velocity. So a stiffer artery would have a faster pulse wave velocity, and an elastic artery would have a slower pulse wave velocity. That's because the elastic arteries have these contractions and expansions that slow the speed of the blood flow. After that, we assessed participants' metabolic health. So first we did a 12-hour fasted finger prick so that we could measure their fasted glucose levels. We used this YTI glucose analyzer. And then we also collected some more of their blood to spin down for insulin to assess their fasting insulin levels. After that, we collected their height, their body mass, and their BMI. And then we also determined their body composition. So for body comp, we used 2 devices. One is the bod pod over here. It uses air displacement plethysmography to determine a person's body volume. And then it uses agents, sex-specific equations, to calculate their fat and fat-free mass. CCAP calculates as well fat and fat-free mass and also total body water. So we use the CCAP just for the total body water measurements. And basically how it does it is it sends the amount of current to the person, and then based on the amount of resistance, it can determine those values. So we also asked participants to complete a 3-day food log and to provide a fecal sample. These analyses are ongoing. For the food log, we're using a chronometer to determine participants' micro and macronutrient consumption. And for the fecal sample, we're doing DNA extractions and then 16S sequencing to determine which bacteria are in the samples. So for results, we collected data from 15 participants who self-identified as healthy. Unfortunately, we did have to exclude 5 of them because either having chronic illnesses or because they had 1 or more factors of metabolic syndrome. Of the 10 participants we did keep, 9 are male, 1 is female. Their average age is 61 years. Average height for males is about 5'11", and for females is about 5'2". For their cardiovascular health, they're all just really healthy. You can see the blood pressure, heart rate, SpO2, and central pulse wave velocity are all well within the healthy ranges. For metabolic health as well, all within the healthy range. You can see the BMI is as well as the waist circumference. For the fat mass as well is within the healthy range. Females obviously have a higher fat mass than males, just because of biology, and then the fat mass in kilograms. We also use the blood plot to determine their predicted resting metabolic rate. Here, the females' RMR is much lower than the males, just because males have a higher lean mass, so they burn more calories at rest. And then total body water and fasting glucose values are also well within the healthy range. So now to their mental health. All the participants reported low levels of, I don't say all, the average reported levels of stress, anxiety, and depression were all low. I'm showing you this graph here on the right of individual participant responses, just because you can notice this one had quite significantly higher depression levels, and this person had the same for anxiety and stress, so this did bring the overall average up a little bit. For physical activity, they all met or exceeded even the 100 the average exceeds the 150-minute weekly recommended amount, and they reported all good physical energy and mental energy levels and low physical and mental fatigue levels. Just with eating patterns, behaviors, and sleep. So eating patterns, their diet quality was good. They didn't have, they had good cognitive restraint. They didn't have much uncontrolled eating or emotional eating. Sleep, however, the average sleep was quite poor. The score of over 5 is known as is called poor. You can see over here the individual responses. A lot of them had quite poor responses. And this is kind of expected. It's known that with older adults, sleep quality decreases because of a variety of factors. So in summary, all of these participants are really healthy, and it'll be really interesting to see the results from the fecal sample analyses so that we can explore sort of what correlations there are between it, or so we can see if their lifestyle and health levels have managed to attenuate the dysbiosis associated with age. And this will also be an amazing group to use as a comparator group for the larger diabetes study, because all of their bodies are so healthy. We'll really get that good contrast between diabetic individuals. And I would just like to acknowledge my supervisor, Dr. Julian Tam, and my co-supervisor, Dr. Andrew Cameron. They've been absolutely amazing in this whole process. I'd also like to thank the members of Camara Labs, Ahmad and Priya Verma, for helping me collect all of the cardiometabolic health data, and members of the IMSS, Christian County, and Niki Afseth for helping me with the fecal sample stuff. And very importantly, I'd also like to thank the participants who took time out of their busy lives to come in and volunteer for this study and were very patient with me as I figured out what I was doing in the lab. Thank you.
Thank you, Priya. Questions for Priya?
Thank you, that was excellent. Kudos to you, it was really well done. The question, were any of the subjects, do you know if they were on a prebiotic or probiotic?
So yes, we did collect that information, and what we noticed was that some of the participants that we had to exclude were the ones on the prebiotic or probiotics. I don't think any of the ones that we kept are on those.
Okay.
Other questions for Priya?
Thanks, Priya. That was really, really good. I was just curious how many people you're trying to collect in total for this comparator group.
So we're aiming for about 20 participants. Obviously, if we can get more, that would be amazing. But we want a good sample size compared to the diabetes study, which will be about 60 participants.
Thanks.
Do you have any sense, Priya, why the sample that you have, that there is only one female? Or how you could get more women?
So the thing is, we did have more female participants, but unfortunately we had to exclude them because of eating that metabolic syndrome factors. I guess just the reason that we don't have more, when we recruited them, we had about a proportionate amount. It's just that we had to exclude them. So I guess that would have to do more with lifestyle factors and health and personal decisions on or personal activity levels. I'm not sure if that answers it.
Yeah, thank you.
And also, if you think about
Oh yeah, for the diabetes study. The diabetes is more common in males than females, so we have been trying to keep a higher proportion of males compared to females.
Any other questions for Priya? Excellent job. Thank you, Priya. longitudinal assessment of overall health after Trikafta in a person with cystic fibrosis, a patient-oriented case study, and I'll turn it over to you, Sirant.
Good. All right. Thank you for the introduction. I'm just going to get started with a quick background on cystic fibrosis and what it actually is. So, cystic fibrosis is an inherited disorder and it affects over 4,300 Canadians, and currently there is no cure. I want to turn your attention just to the numbers over here. As you can see, the population in Saskatchewan is very limited, at 114 people total. Just for a little bit of physiology background on cystic fibrosis. So basically, it's the cystic fibrosis transmembrane regulator gene, which codes for the CFTR protein. Normally, this protein pumps chloride ions into secretions, and then the chloride draws in water, which causes a thinning of the mucus secretions. However, in people with cystic fibrosis, most commonly this is the deletion of the F508 amino acid. The CFTR protein fails to pump in the chloride ions, which causes less chloride ions within the actual to be pumped into the secretions, which causes less water to be drawn in, which causes a buildup of thick, sticky mucus. And in comes Trikafta. So Trikafta is a triple combination medication consisting of lexicaptor, tezacaptor, and ivacaptor. It targets the defect in the CFTR protein. So the lexicaptor and tezacaptor work together to help the protein to reach the cell surface, whereas the ivacaptor helps the CFTR protein stay open for longer at the cell surface. Trikafta was approved by Health Canada very recently on the 18th of June 2021 and was added to the exception drug status program in Saskatchewan on the 24th of September 2021. It's publicly funded and it's available to cystic fibrosis patients aged 12 or older. So initial clinical trials have shown that Trikafta has shown improvement in lung function, soy chloride levels, and respiratory symptoms as well. Respiratory symptoms, soy chloride levels, and it has also shown a decrease in pulmonary exacerbations. So now I'm just going to play a quick video from Alison Hamilton, who is the participant in this study. She's also been critical in the development and execution of the study, and she's going to go over her experience living with cystic fibrosis as well as her experience with Trikafta so far.
Does anyone know if we can get volume through this?
You'll have to,
Oh, what?
yeah, have it normal.
Hi there, I'm Alison Hamilton. I was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis when I was 13 months old, and I recently have been able to start on a miracle drug that is called Trikafta. It has been changing the lives of many people with cystic fibrosis across the country, across the continent, across the world. It just recently came to Canada and is added into the provincial coverage program for Saskatchewan. And so I started the drug in January. And like I said, I've been seeing great results already. I am also partnering on this study, the case series, and I believe I'm the first patient partner to partner with it. And I just want to tell you a little bit about myself and how this came to be and why I'm so excited about it. So I'm going to walk you through the last 40 years of my life in a very quick pace. So bear with me. I just want to be able to just show that cystic fibrosis is so much more impactful than just respiratory issues, which is the most common. The most common issue is with the lungs. But for me, it is much more than that. It's the full body, and that's the same with a lot of people with CF. It's not just the lungs. So I'll just get into this really quickly here. So like I mentioned, I was born and had immediately, it's hereditary, so I was born with this. I had digestive issues immediately and chronic ear and chest infections early on. Then at around 13 months, they finally decided that maybe we should get me tested for cystic fibrosis. So we performed the standardized test, the sweat chloride test, which confirmed that cystic fibrosis was present. 18 months old, I had my first very serious hospitalization. I was sent home unsure if I would live or die. When I was 5 years old, first signs of nasal polyp issues, and so I had nasal polyps removed then. Throughout the next few number of years, university, I had my second nasal polyp surgery. When I was 25, I had my third nasal polyp surgery. See, it's a recurring issue. I was married in 2010. I had a daughter in 2014. I put these on the timeline because, again, like I mentioned, I was diagnosed when I was 13 months old. And my parents were told to only expect me to live until 13 at the oldest. So to get married and have a child was pretty significant in my lifetime. Diagnosed with CF-related diabetes, insulin dependent. Diagnosed with CF-related liver. Made some changes in my lifestyle and medication to address the liver issues. Treatment for respiratory issues did ramp up when I was around 30. I started to be hospitalized for more lung issues. I was also hospitalized for sepsis. I had some bile duct infection that got out of control. Psychiatry was added to my CF treatment and my team at that time, mainly because of I had PTSD from the hospitalization where I was septic. Hospitalization or tune-ups. Tune-ups is just when you have recurring lung infections and you have to go in hospital to get IV treatment. Bowel blockages, hospitalization, home treatments for that, and throughout the last number of years, numerous ERCPs, that's a procedure to remove bowel stones from the bile ducts, and numerous rounds of oral antibiotics to treat repeat infections. But that brings us to 2022, star on here, because, like I mentioned earlier, able to start Trikafta. So the study, I was sitting around with one of my friends, Dr. Totosy de Zepetnek, and we were talking about how exciting it was that Trikafta was coming. And I said, you know, I really wish that there was more information about the impacts on the rest of the body, not just the lungs. And so we talked about the lab and the different options that we had for potentially partnering and me being directly involved as a patient in the study as well. So that's kind of kicked off, and Julia reached out to others and partnered with all those you see here. Like I said, my perspective was that the Trikafta research to date has been pretty focused on lungs and respiratory results. And like I showed you in my timeline, it impacts my whole body. And so I really wanted to know if there was other ways, other things that we could be testing for over the same follow-up testing period that the clinical team follows up on. And the clinical team mostly is focusing on pulmonary function results, the sweat chloride result, and other clinical aspects. But I just felt like there was some things missing. And so in talking with Julia and other members of the team, we found that there was a number of different things that we could be looking at to really assess the whole person. So that's about it for my portion. Just want to say thank you for your time and attention. If anybody has any questions about my experience or why I'm excited to be doing this, please feel free to reach out, and I'd love to talk with you. Hi.
All right, so I hope everyone found Alison's insight a little bit interesting. As just going to move on to the objective of the study. So as Alison highlighted, there's a misconception that Trikafta only affects the lungs. In this study, we're taking a more comprehensive approach by assessing several health measures. The objective of the study is to explore health benefits and potential side effects of Trikafta in persons with cystic fibrosis, and is in partnership with the SHA, whose focus is respiratory health. So there's just an overview of methods. Testing is split up into 3 days. Day 1 consists of a lifestyle survey. Day 2 consists of the majority of the testing that we're doing at our labs, which starts off with a 12-hour overnight fast. Alison comes in, gets her blood pressure done, RMR, then a blood draw, then we move on to heart rate variability and pulse rate velocity, followed by body composition. Then she goes next door over to Dr. Mang's lab for nerve conduction velocity, and then we finish it off with a VO2 peak. The next day, a neuropsychological evaluation is done by a Zoom. Okay, so for the methods. First, we start off with the rest of the metabolic rate. As I said, Alison comes in 12 hours fasted, and the duration of the test is about 45 minutes. She lies down in a supine position, awake, and she has a ventilated hood over her, as you can see right there. And this analyzes gas exchange in order to determine her resting energy expenditure at rest. And then moving on to blood pressure and arterial stiffness. I won't go over that too much in detail, as we already did. And we also measured heart rate variability by ECG. Next is anthropometrics in the body composition. So we take Alison's height and body mass, use that to calculate her BMI. And then, like I said earlier, blood product and SICA are used for body composition. The SICA's main purpose is just to use to determine your total body water, whereas the blood clot is used for other metrics such as total weight, lean body mass, etc. Next is the fitness testing, where we do a VO2 peak test. It's an incremental test where the wattage is increased by 1 watt every 4 seconds. And we're measuring heart rates, expired gases, ventilatory parameters, as well as rating of perceived exertion or RPE. These are the results from the SHA testing so far. So as you can see, we only have baseline and 1 month results thus far. As for sweat chloride results, you can see at baseline, Alison had approximately 73 millimoles per liter on her testing, and at 1 month, this was down to 12. So this put her from a range which was indicative of cystic fibrosis to cystic fibrosis unlikely. So you can see that these are clinically significant results. As for the spirometry values, they also increased. The forced expiratory volume in 1 second was up by 3%, and the forced vital capacity was up by 6%. Moving on to the resting metabolic rate, there hasn't really been much change, so I won't, I guess, just skip this right now in the interest of time. Same goes for the cardiovascular health. Most of the metrics remain relatively similar. And then for the anthropometrics and body composition, I would like to point out that her BMI did increase, and as well as her waist circumference. However, this mostly came through fat-free mass, and you can see from the minor increase in total body water that we can assume that most of it was in the form of muscle mass. Moving on to the interesting stuff now. These results were very surprising for us. Her VO2 peak in 1 month increased by 18%. Peak power output was up 15%, and ventilation was up by 50%. Peak heart rate and maximum heart rate were both up by around 10%, and the duration of the test increased by 58%. We also asked Alison her peak RPE values at the end of the test, both central and peripheral, and they were up 33 and 13% respectively. Central is looking at the heart and the lungs, and peripheral is looking at her legs. So basically how much she feels that she's exerting at those points. Next is the results from the lifestyle factors surveys. As we can see, her stress levels were down by 65%, her energy levels were up, and her fatigue levels were down. Physical activity also increased by infinity. Okay, so sleep results. The sleep remained relatively similar. Eating patterns were down. Cognitive restraint was up, and uncontrolled eating was also up. However, emotional eating was down. Okay, moving on to the discussion. So the main points I would like to highlight are the cardiovascular improvement, which we hypothesize could be possibly due to the increased physical energy. She had a 400% increase from baseline to 1 month in her survey results. And she also displayed reduced physical fatigue, which could play into it. She also had an increase in fat-free mass, and like I said, we can assume that this was most likely muscle mass, or a majority of it was muscle mass due to the small increase in water. And physical activity levels were also up. She was being more active in general, which could be the reason that her cardiovascular health also shot up this much. And I'd also like to point out that we also have several metrics that are still left to be analyzed: heart rate variability, blood logs, stool sample, blood biomarkers, nerve conduction velocity, as well as a psychiatric interview, which would likely give more insight into this reduced stress, mental fatigue, and physical fatigue. Okay, and I would also like to thank Alison Hamilton, as well as everyone involved in the presentation.
Any questions for Sirant?
So just to clarify, the only thing that changed is she's on this drug, right? There's no like exercise program or anything else that she was prescribed, it's just that drug?
Yes.
Thanks so much. That was quite fascinating, actually. Sort of, Paul, do you know the type of drug it is? Is it like a catabolic steroid, or do you know the type of drug it is?
Well, I know it's a triple combination drug, and I know it works to move the chloride channels, and I believe it puts that in place. And that, like I mentioned, it's a triple combination drug. 2 of the drugs work to bring the protein up to the surface, whereas the last one works to keep it open long enough for it to act.
So with regard to those sweat chloride values that you showed and those significant changes, like presumably that's the surrogate outcome measure. Do you have any idea of how that actually affects outcomes in the long term?
I'm not sure how that would affect outcomes in the long term, but also looking at the clinical trials, data has shown that sweat chloride levels are one of the first major changes that occurs. People with cystic fibrosis have very salty sweat, so that's basically what that's testing, so what levels in sweat. And then people noticed, or 5 trials have noticed that immediately after initiation of Trikafta, these values drop off quite significantly.
So this is a case study with Alison. Do you have any plans to do it with anybody else? Like, have you recruited anybody else, or is anybody else going to be part of this?
So recruitment is being done by the SHA and Dr. Julian Tam. So if he does find any people with cystic fibrosis who are willing to participate, then he's going to collaborate with us on this as well, or participants.
Great. Thank you very much, Ziaur, for your presentation. and blood pressure variability following concussion in varsity athletes. So I'll turn it over to you, Jason.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so I'm excited to talk to you about some of my research regarding alterations in ferroreflex sensitivity and blood pressure variability following concussion. So first, I'd like to quickly start by just a quick overview of concussion. I think when discussing concussion, it's important to acknowledge that the exact pathophysiology following concussion is still somewhat uncertain. It is a subject of significant debate. However, one thing the literature has kind of converged upon is this idea of the neurometabolic cascade following concussion, as shown in this figure here. And this essentially is all of these changes leading to a state resembling an energy crisis, whereby there's a high demand for energy in the brain following a concussion, in concert with a low supply. Now, with regard to this specific figure, I'd like to focus our attention on the bottom portion here, specifically looking at the decreases in cerebral flow, leading to impairments in cerebral autoregulation, which will become important for reasons that will be evident later on in my presentation. Now, just quickly, I'd like to give a bit of an overview on the two parameters that we focused on, first being spontaneous baroreflex sensitivity. Now, this is a surrogate measure of the arterial baroreflex, which is essentially just a negative feedback mechanism that buffers against large fluctuations in arterial pressure. It does this through sensing mechanical deformation in baroreceptors located within both the aortic arch and the carotid arteries, and then sends information to various areas within the brainstem as well as other cortical areas to modulate the autonomic nervous system in an effort to either change cardiac output or total peripheral resistance in order to help try and maintain a stable blood pressure. Now, spontaneous baroreflex sensitivity is essentially just calculated using consecutive RR intervals in concert with runs of increasing or decreasing blood pressure, defined as 3 or more increasing sequences or decreasing for BRS down or up, as well as the total weighted average for BRS cooled. Now, with regards to its importance and relevance to concussion, there has been some preliminary research by LaFontaine's group suggesting BRS dysfunction following concussion, as seen in the figure there. With regard to systolic blood pressure variability, which is our second parameter we focused in on, this is essentially just looking at the variability and the fluctuations in systolic blood pressure. And this is heavily influenced both by respiration as well as various cardiovascular reflexes. What we did is we used spectral techniques or transfer function analysis in order to separate this blood pressure variability into low frequency, high frequency, as well as total power. And what this gave us the ability to do is to have some insight into autonomic regulation of the cardiovascular system. With a specific regard to concussion, Jyotpal Singh in our lab has demonstrated decreased blood pressure variability in individuals with post-concussion syndrome, along with improvements in blood pressure variability in concert with improvements in symptoms. Now, what is the issue? So the issue is that establishing objective physiological biomarkers of concussion has remained elusive despite the large amount of research in the area. Now, BRS and BPV have both been proposed as potential biomarkers of concussion. However, the existing literature is both scarce and limited for various reasons of methodology that I'll discuss further. Now, with regards to our specific study, we did it within subject design. And I want to talk a bit about this, as this is a really important way we address some of the flaws in the previous literature, being that they employed the between subject design. And this is really important because with these various measures of the autonomic nervous system, we know there's large inter-individual variability. So comparing one person post-injury to a healthy age-matched control can very greatly limit your ability to make generalizations. And this can just be illustrated here with this hypothetical example, whereby we're seeing a concussed athlete compared to a control participant, who they both have very similar, if not the same, values in baroreflex sensitivity. However, if we were to compare them to their own baseline, we might see a difference. So in employing this between subject design, we have the potential of masking actual differences just based on that wide variability. Now, furthermore, just with regards to how we collected our data, all athletes at the University of Regina undergo baseline physiological assessments prior to their season. In the event that they're diagnosed with concussion, they'll all undergo multiple post-concussion assessments in our lab. And we defined within our study our visit 1 as occurring between days 1 to 5. This is essentially the acute period. Then we just included a visit 2, day 6 to 14 for a secondary analysis to look at how these changes may persist or change throughout. And altogether, 15 athletes were included in our analysis. And the only exclusion criteria we had was just essentially visually inspecting the data to look for any significant artifact or ectopy within the blood pressure waveform as well as ECG. Concerning our protocol, what we did is we used a version of the NERD protocol, specifically the controlled breathing section, in order to collect our data. So what this looked like is a 5-minute seated rest, essentially just to establish baseline physiology, to get used to the equipment, used to the testing environment, followed by our 5-minute controlled breathing protocol, which is at a frequency of 0.1 hertz or 6 breaths per minute. And this essentially just consists of the assessor instructing the individual to inhale for 5 seconds, followed by an exhale, repeated for 5 minutes. Now this is important for a few reasons. So this here is just a 30-second snapshot of what our controlled breathing protocol looks like with respect to mean arterial pressure and heart rate. And specifically with regard to baroreflex sensitivity, this is important because in order to elicit a robust baroreflex response, you need to have some sort of physiological perturbance. And another limitation in the previous research is that they didn't control for respiration. They just assessed BRS at seated rest. And what we assert is that this isn't a valid enough way to elicit that large fluctuation in mean arterial pressure shown here in order to actually elicit that baroreflex response. Furthermore, with regards to blood pressure variability, as I mentioned previously, it's also largely affected by respiration. And the lack of controlled respiration really, again, limits those results in their interpretability because there's that large confounder of respiratory rate. In addition, we made sure to complete our follow-up assessments at the same time of day as the baseline assessment just to control for the potential confounding impact of circadian rhythms. And we instructed our athletes to refrain from alcohol, exercise, and caffeine. Collecting our data, we got non-invasive BTD blood pressure through finger photoplethysmography and our interval data using a 3-lead ECG. And BRS was assessed using Ensemble R software. Now here's the first table just showing our comparisons between baseline and visit 1, or the acute visit. And what we showed was significant increases in baroreflex sensitivity with decreases in blood pressure variability. Now I'd like to quickly revisit that first figure that we talked about where it showed decreases in cerebral blood flow in addition to impairments in cerebral water regulation. So as the literature has shown that cerebral blood flow is controlled primarily through both cerebral autorregulation as well as the baroreflex response. Furthermore, literature has demonstrated that there is typically an inverse correlation between these two parameters. So what we hypothesized, while we don't have the direct cerebral blood flow data to actually make these conclusions, is that these observed changes we're seeing is essentially a compensatory mechanism, whereby the decreases in blood pressure variability in the context of our controlled breathing protocol is indicative of decreased cerebral autorregulation, with the increase in baroreflex sensitivity being an indicator of the compensatory response in order to try and maintain cerebral blood flow and cerebral perfusion. Now here's just our second table regarding our percent changes and looking at that baseline to visit 2. This just illustrates the general directionality as well as some percent values of our changes. With regards to the implications of our data, what we showed is significant alterations in BRS and BPD following concussion in the acute period. And this essentially just has the potential to help individuals in making diagnosis with regards to concussion, as well as managing concussion and informing return to play decisions. So that's my presentation. Here's just a quick acknowledgement, conflict of interest statement, some references, and I'd just like to say thank you to Dr. Patrick Mary, Jyotpal Singh, and everyone else involved in this project. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you, Chase, for your presentation. Any questions for Chase?
guess I could put you halfway. Chase, great job. Just a really quick question. So, with the blood pressure variability in post-concussion syndrome, that was improved with phytocannabinoid administration.
Yeah.
So that was also post-concussion syndrome. So can you think of any way that that can apply here as well to acute concussion?
So you're saying with regards to like the intervention in that scenario?
Yeah, any type of intervention.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I think that's an important and interesting comment, especially with regards to the recent NFL grant that we got and how cannabis can potentially play a role in improvement. And yeah, with regards to my mention of that, it is hard to generalize from that study, and I think that's why our research is important, as it's showing in acute concussion, whereas yours was post-concussion syndrome. But yeah, I think it highlights a potential role for cannabis in order to help with recovery and concussion.
Yeah, and another area I think that's taking off now is early exercise interventions, along with acute concussion as well. So, so far they've shown improvements in HRV only, so I think this would go hand in hand with that too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Other questions for Chase?
Thanks, Chase. It's really neat to see the research that you're doing. I was just curious what you think of like you talk about developing more objective markers of concussion on an individual basis, and I'm just wondering, since your analyses are focused on like group means and there's variability within those groups or at those time points, where you think these types of measures can play in on like an individualized diagnosis or prognostic.
Yeah, no, great question. And I think that goes hand in hand with what we use our data for in our lab, as well as with helping manage concussion in those athletes. While it is true that we were showing group means, a lot of those changes are quite consistent across those groups, and we do look at them on an individualized basis. And when you're doing that, you have the ability to compare people to their preseason baseline and see how these various measures may be impacted following concussion. And then you can follow up with these to see the individual's potential recovery or how long their symptoms may prolong. And that can be used to help inform anyone dealing with a concussed athlete with regards to the recovery, return to play, and really that integration between the cardiovascular and autonomic nervous system.
Thanks, Chase.
Real briefly. Thanks, Chase. Have any of the athletes complained about the 6 breaths per minute and that being a difficulty?
No, not that I've anyway experienced within the year I've been doing the testing. I haven't heard any, other than maybe the odd athlete being relaxed from the controlled breathing, but yeah, that's kind of the only thing.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any further questions? No, thank you very much, Chase, for your presentation. Exploring creatine supplementation timing strategies for optimal muscle performance. Over to you, Scotty.
Perfect. Hey, thank you so much. And welcome to the final presentation of the day, which is great because I was guaranteed unlimited amount of time for my presentation. And also, PhD student under supervision of Dr. Bernat. So we explored some timing strategies in a master's project, and we're going to expand on that into some PhD studies. So a little bit of an overview of my presentation today. Very, very simple. We'll talk about creatine. We'll talk about some creatine timing theory as well as some of the literature. And then we'll go over what our preliminary ideas for our studies are. Of course, they're probably going to change a few more times before we actually implement them, but we'll start with what we have today. And then we'll do a little bit of a Q&A at the end. So pretty simple presentation, should be fun. So we all probably know now, because of all we could also consume it in the diet, and it's found in foods like red meats and seafoods, as well as some poultry as well. So we can consume it naturally in the diet, or we can supplement it in a synthetic form. What we do need to know is that we can create it in the liver, kidney, or in sort of the synthesis of it is in some of the organs, but primarily we store creatine in the muscles, and it's stored as phosphocreatine and then free creatine. So majority of it is in the muscles that we can use to perform exercise, which is great. And again, one of the major reasons individuals supplement with it or consume high creatine foods in the diet. So the one thing that we know is that we have ATP in our body, and then we break down the ATP to produce energy for our activities that we're doing. Once the ATP is broken down, adenosine triphosphate is broken down into ADP, releases a high energy bond, and then we get that release of energy, which is great. So high volumes or high numbers of ATP is good for the activity that we are doing. So just a little bit of a review from our intro to sort of physiology. We have our ATP, and we have these high energy phosphate bonds. Once they're broken, we get ADP, adenosine diphosphate, inorganic phosphate, and this release of energy to make sure that we can do our activities that we want. One other thing is that we have these phosphocreatines in the body that are also able to be broken down. So we can donate this phosphate group into the ATP phosphocreatine system. And what that looks like in a schematic would be here. We have our phosphocreatine that's sitting around in the muscles. We consume that creatine and then store it into the muscles. We can break this into inorganic phosphate, and then we get this creatine via an enzyme called creatine kinase, and we get this release of energy. Now with this inorganic phosphate, we can replenish some of these ATP stores, so we have some more energy to pull throughout everything. So this is the main sort of theory in how creatine supplementation and the energy system will work for high intensity, short duration exercise. Now, it would make sense that this increase in intramuscular creatine, so consumption of creatine in the diet, should increase phosphocreatine stores, and then the ability for that phosphocreatine to resynthesize ADP into ATP over time, leading to greater muscle mass and muscle performance over time. So short improvements or little improvements over a long period of time will overall lead to greater gains in muscle performance. So we have a recent body of literature looking at creatine timing strategies as maybe an important strategy for maximizing the gains that we see with resistance training. You know, we see muscle performance benefits from resistance training or from exercise, but creatine ingestion, as well as timing of creatine ingestion, may be another important strategy to take into consideration to maximize those gains. So we have a small collection of studies showing that creatine supplementation in close proximity to exercise sees increases in, obviously, intramuscular phosphocreatine concentrations, and then we see improvements or increases in muscle mass, as well as some measurements of muscle performance, which we'll get into in a little bit. And it may provide superior benefits when compared to other times of the day, evenings, mornings, or on non-training days. So this is sort of the basic theory behind some of the research that's coming out and what we're going to explore. So hypothetically, we think some mechanisms are happening in combination when we are exercising and consuming creatine at the same time. So we know that during exercise, we see some increased blood flow or redistribution of blood flow that comes with exercise. So with that redistribution of blood flow, we should see increased nutrient delivery to the muscles via the bloodstream. So if we were to time that with our creatine supplementation, we should see increased creatine delivery to the muscles, and then overall we should see increased creatine content being stored in the muscle, which is great. That's what we want: more creatine in the muscle, more replenishment of our ADP, more intense exercise for longer durations. We also see that we get an increased activation of the sodium-potassium pump, which is sort of this sort of pathway, the creatine activity, which sort of relies on that ability for the creatine to be delivered to the muscle, sort of relies on that activation of that sodium-potassium pump. So again, we'll get increased creatine uptake due to this increased sodium-potassium pump from the exercise. We should see that increased uptake, and again, leading to increased total muscle content. When we look at the theory behind timing our creatine in close proximity to our training session, whether we're doing a resistance training session or cardiovascular, we see those different parameters happen. So exercise, we get this redistribution of blood flow to our muscles, and then we increase the activity of the sodium-potassium pump and that activity where we get the delivery of creatine. Now, if we were to time our creatine ingestion, either pre, during, or post, we see that there's a sort of peak peripheral or plasma blood creatine level, basically around an hour after consumption. So if we can time our plasma, our peak plasma concentration of creatine to maximize creatine delivery with our different physiological changes that come with the onset of exercise, this should, in theory, give us a window of opportunity to maximize maximize the gains that we get from our exercise. So this is where we get the idea that creatine timing may be an important strategy. So on to the studies that we are going to look to explore for some research. We have some questions of studies or areas that we want to look at. So supplementing with creatine immediately before or immediately after exercise in young adults. So we have seen this in older individuals, but nothing has been done in young adults. Morning versus evening supplementation of creatine in combination or on resistance training days, as well as on training days or supplement with on non-training days. And we'll get a little bit more detail of these specific studies here now. Now, when we are looking at maximizing creatine uptake or the benefits from creatine, we are doing measurements, or I'm looking at muscle performance or optimizing muscle performance. So the way we measure those through our dependent variables is we measure muscle thickness. So we would do muscle thickness through a muscle ultrasound at the bicep, tricep, quad, and hamstring. We might do calves in there if they're in letting. When we look at muscular power, we'll do upper body and lower body power production via the vertical jump, and then upper body test of power with the medicine ball throw test. We might do it standing, but likely we'll do it in a seated position, just to take away some of that lower body power production. To test muscular strength, we'll do a 1 repetition max on a leg press and machine chest press. And then to test our muscular endurance, we'll take 50% of their max and do 1 set to failure or to volitional fatigue. And then keep in mind that post-testing, we'll take the same weight, so 50% of the 1 repetition max on the pre-test to see if there was a change in muscular endurance. And of note, we will do a diet or calorie intake assessment via food record, just to see if there's any change in caloric intake, macronutrient distribution, which can happen through increased intensity of training or implementing a higher volume training protocol may sort of trigger a natural instinct to consume more, which happens over. So to go through our studies, creatine before versus after in young adults. So this is what our study will look like. We have our training days. We would have group number 1. They would consume a creatine monohydrate supplementation pre-exercise. They would do their workout and they would take a placebo supplement post-exercise. Group number 2 would just do the opposite. They supplement with the placebo before, with their creatine monohydrate supplementation in the post-exercise week. That third group would do placebo versus placebo, just to make sure that we have a control group. And we just looked at the effect of the resistance training program rather than the resistance training program in combination with the creatine monohydrate supplementation. Some of the other parameters that we look at, young individuals, 18 to 39, and have performed some sort of structured resistance training program more than 3 days a week for 6 months, just so we make sure, because we'll probably use a self-log or self-reported study, that safety stays high and adherence will be high as well. For the training, they would do a 6-week training program, periodized training program, and hopefully, I'm going to convince Darren to let me do this up to 12 weeks. As well, they're going to do a 4-day routine, so quite an intense program, 2 days on, 1 day off, involving the whole body musculature, sort of our push-pull leg type split, or upper body, lower body, or full body training. We'll sort that out. And then there'll be supplementation, either creatine monohydrate or the placebo groups at the same dose of 1 gram per kilogram of body weight, only on training days. Study number 2, morning versus evening. Same sort of idea. We have training days. Group number 1 would do a creatine supplementation in the morning, training sometime during the day, as well as their placebo in the evening. Similar to our first study, second group will do placebo in the morning, creatine at night, and then the last group will be placebo versus placebo. And all the same parameters will be put in place for a then sort of cross-study analysis after the studies have been ran. Just 1 second. We're installing SPSS. Okay, not today, team. Okay, so they'll have the same placebo or creatine with the same dosages. All very, very similar to the same as the first study, but just different times of the day. Again, overall, we're looking at optimizing creatine timing ingestion, so that's sort of the basis of the study. Now, when we look at our final study, training days versus non-training days, this is to really look at if we can sort of deduce or decide if creatine is affected by blood flow. So if training or supplementing with creatine on training days has any difference. So does blood flow, nutrient delivery have any effect on creatine or optimizing creatine for enhancements of performance? So we'll have 2 groups. One will take a creatine monohydrate at some point on their non-training days, and then they'll do a placebo in their post-exercise window. Opposite group will take a placebo on their non-training days, and then a creatine supplementation in their post-exercise window. Again, we'll use young males and females. The only difference here is that they'll do a 1 day on, 1 day off training program, so that their dosage and their training volume is standardized across the week and across both groups. Same thing, creatine monohydrate or a multidextrine supplement. So those will be our ideas for some studies, and I would be happy and willing to field any questions about that.
Thank you, Scotty. Questions for Scotty? I have one for you. You talked about the idea about going to a 12-week program.
Yeah.
Why a 12 versus a 6?
Oh, what a great question. Okay, so I'm just gonna explain here. So ideally, because my master's thesis, we looked at intra-workout consumption of creatine. So we had 2 groups. Creatine, we had a creatine group during their workout and a placebo group during the workout. We did baseline testing and then a 6-week program, and then we did their post-testing. So ideally, if we can move to, well, the results that we found is that we did see an increase in strength and muscular endurance. Not muscular endurance in the upper body, but of the lower body. But in terms of our measurements of power, as well as our measurement of power, we didn't see any significant change. And I sort of think that with a longer duration study, because of how long it takes the muscles to become fully saturated with creatine, we just may need that longer duration. So if we were able to do a baseline testing, a 6-week testing, and a 12-week test, we can use the 12-week study as a paper, and then see the changes in the first half versus the second half, maybe as muscle saturation of creatine goes up, and then do a comparative study that compares morning consumption of creatine, like in study 2, versus pre, versus intra, versus post, versus evening, all with that 6-week length to be standard against the master study for a more thorough investigation into creatine time strategies.
Thanks, Scotty.
Yeah.
Other questions for Scotty?
Thanks, Scotty. Yeah, really nice and clear and well laid out ideas. I was just curious, what do you think you'll see in terms of results with the morning versus the evening group? And is there any consideration of like any diurnal physiological changes that could impact the effects of creatine supplementation?
What was that last part?
Just like fluctuations through the day in our physiology, from morning to evening, thinking of like diurnal changes.
For sure. Yeah, it was one thing that I did think about. I would suspect that in a situation where creatine can be replenished once depleted, we would be a little bit in a more advantageous spot. So in the morning, when we do have some rest, and maybe in a resting state where ATP levels are quite high, we haven't had any sort of exercise throughout the day, maybe replenishing it, or putting our dietary creatine in a position where we already are fully saturated in the muscles, maybe we wouldn't see as much delivery just because we're fully saturated. But at the end of the day, when we have done some activity through the day and had depleted some of our creatine stores, replenishing that may see some more benefit. So sort of replenishing it at a time where we're more depleted would, in theory, or I suspect, be more advantageous. Yeah. Those are awesome questions.
Okay, thanks, Scotty. Since you're going to be using like trained or exercising individuals, most might be familiar with creatine or on it when you try to recruit. How are you going to overcome that potential limitation?
For sure. Yeah, so one of the inclusion criteria will be that they can't have supplemented with creatine for a month or 4 weeks leading up to the study, because we do see in the literature that it takes approximately 4 weeks at that sort of maintenance dosage to become fully saturated with creatine. So no creatine 4 weeks leading up to the study, so they can either stop taking creatine, or if they have never taken creatine before that. So everybody will at least have been 4 weeks prior to starting the study with no creatine consumption.
Any other questions? Yep.
Hey.
Great talk. Speaking of what you said about the creatine delivery to the muscles, seeing from the other side, does creatine delivery to the muscles affect angiogenesis, formation of blood vessels around that muscle, the more creatine delivered to those muscles? Does it affect like formation of blood vessels?
Right. Yeah. That's a great question. I would say that my ideas would be if you had more lean muscle tissue, you would probably see more creatine uptake just for the increase in lean mass. You may see more pathways be available through trained muscles. So there might be some physiological adaptation that would come with higher intakes of creatine. So I can see that happening. More activity for that sodium potassium pump, or creatine delivery through exercise, as well as the presence of creatine in the bloodstream. So there's probably multiple factors that would increase delivery with supplementation and with increased exercise and training volume. That's an awesome question here.
So I was just wondering, when you get the participants to consume their creatine, like, are you going to like specify how you want like the supplements consumed, like as in like water or juice, or like with like maybe there are other like supplements they use if you're allowing that?
Right. Yeah. And that's a great question too, because if we were to look at, say, co-ingestion of creatine with, say, like with a protein or with a carbohydrate powder or with a Gatorade or milk, co-ingestion of creatine with other nutrients is an interesting area of research. So I think that for our study, it would be that you consume your creatine with water, 0-calorie liquid, with your other dietary intake throughout the day. That's sort of on you, and that's sort of revealed through the 3-day log. But the ingestion of creatine has to be consumed with isocaloric beverage.
So just water?
Yes, water. Yeah.
Okay. And will that affect how the body intakes and like absorbs?
For sure. It will take away the sort of situation in which there's increased or decreased delivery with other nutrients. So it will at least be standard, but yeah, sort of the consumption of creatine monohydrate in a water. So as you consume it, the monohydrate sort of molecule is sloughed off, and then we just can have the creatine molecule, which is the same as the molecule that we produce in the body. So at least it's are sort of standardized between groups.
Any final questions for Scotty? No, thank you, Scotty, and thank you to everyone that was presented today and came today. It was an excellent event. That concludes it. I'm the last presentation.